Hello. I'd like to warmly welcome you to this lecture with our guest, art historian and curator, Margaret Koerner from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Against all nor'easter and 4-hour Logan Airport delay odds, we're together this afternoon to examine the works of William Kentridge. Some of you may remember that the Wex organized a Kentridge exhibition in 2006, 7 fragments for Georges Méliès, which, like the Refusal of Time, was curated by Bill Horrigan and also assembled in Gallery D. If you've had a chance to visit the Refusal of Time, you may have heard it first on your approach from the shimmering, bejeweled world of Todd Oldham. A pummeling crescendo of horns, metronomes that slice the air, plaintive calls washing over in slow waves. On nearly every occasion I've visited the Refusal of Time to try a new chair and megaphone, the room has been absolutely packed with students. Thank you to our Ohio State colleagues who have brought their classes to the galleries this spring. I'd also like to especially thank Richard Fletcher, a regular co-conspirator, and the mind behind Alarm Clock Academy, which you can find out more about on our website. Margaret Koerner's exhibition, Smoke, Ashes, Fable, in Bruges, just closed on February 25th. Held at the 12th century St. John's Hospital, Koerner worked closely with Kentridge on this exhibition that contained over 30 years of his work. Undoubtedly, the show and the catalog available in our store will be essential to all future Kentridge scholars. Koerner received her PhD in art history from Columbia University and has worked at the Courtauld Art Institute of Chicago and the Met. She and her husband, Joseph Koerner, co-teach a graduate seminar on Kentridge at Harvard. All of us may want to inquire about enrollment, not only to have the Koerners as professors, but this group of students has visited Johannesburg and Kentridge's studio. As Kentridge took the leaps from contemporary life to the worlds of Giotto and Goya and so many others, Koerner made bounds from her scholarship in 15th century Northern Renaissance work to that of Kentridge. Since 2012, when the artist delivered his Norton lectures at Harvard, Koerner has devoted herself, through articles, interviews, the exhibition in Bruges, and more, to illuminating his life and work for art history. Please join me in welcoming Margaret Koerner.
Hello. Well, it's an enormous pleasure to be here, especially for such a reason. And whatever delays were necessary was no problem as long as I made it here, and I did. So everything's downhill from here, hopefully. So I'll just dive in. I should just give you a sense that there's going to be a lot of images in a Kentridge-like fashion. Just let them go by you, and I'm happy to answer any questions after. In the spring of 2012, William Kentridge gave the Norton Lectures at Harvard. Other Norton professors have included T.S. Eliot, Igor Stravinsky, Erwin Panofsky, and Toni Morrison. MoMA director Glenn Lowry gave the introduction to the penultimate lecture in the series of 6, in which he declared, quote, "There are only a handful of artists that one has the privilege of encountering in one's lifetime, whose work stops you dead in your tracks, makes you think and feel differently." When he saw Kentridge's animated film Felix in Exile at Documenta 10 in 1997, he had chills. For me, it was the Norton Lectures, which you see happening there. A theatrical performance that gave a primer on the South African context and a response to the great question, why become an artist? They were my introduction, and my experience was similar to Lowry's. I attended each week, increasingly convinced that I was witnessing history. I was so deeply affected that it set me on a new course. Having trained in the field of early Netherlandish and Italian 15th century art, I shifted my attention to the present, to try to understand the work of this living artist from South Africa, a country about which I knew little. Now, 6 years later, I've not yet attempted an interpretation of Refusal of Time, destined to be a stream of examples and references, hastily mentioned and probably never complete. It may be the kind of task only an early Netherlandish specialist / iconographer would set for themselves. I've wondered, does one attempt to find a specific reading, explain a narrative, or draw conclusions in contemporary art the way one does with Jan van Eyck? I've come to believe that with Kentridge one can, though he may not subscribe 100% to the outcome. What holds Lowry's attention, he explained, is, quote, the powerful narrative structure of Kentridge's work at a time when storytelling and narration were being critiqued, not to mention attacked from almost every corner. Mr. Kentridge's work dared to underscore the important ways in which biography and history, national identity and colonialism, the Holocaust and the traumas of survival could be investigated through the visual arts, end quote. The range of sources and techniques is so dense, and Kentridge's own resistance to certainty so much overrides virtually any other concern that a single interpretation is impossible. But this at least will provide some solace to those who, like me, walked into the installation and did not know what to make of it. I hasten to add that Refusal of Time is, in my opinion, not only one of the most ambitious of his works, it's also one of the best, along with the Norton Lectures, his operas, and the animated short films. As with any of the great works that stand the test of time, Refusal of Time functions on many levels. This is an introduction to those layers of content and what they may be trying to express. Kentridge began his final lecture at Harvard, which overlapped chronologically and substantively with his work on Refusal of Time, with the following narrative, which bears quoting at some length here. This is William talking. When I was 8 years old, my father took me and my sister on a train journey from Johannesburg to Port Elizabeth. On the train, he read us the story of Perseus and the slaying of the Gorgon Medusa, from a book of children's stories of Greek myths. The king of Argos asked the oracle how long he would live. The oracle declined to give him a number, but told him he would be killed by his grandson. The king, terrified, had his own daughter, Danae, locked in a chamber with neither door nor window. But Zeus, king of the gods, saw her through a crack in the wall. He entered the room as a shower of gold. He seduced and impregnated Danae. She bears a son, Perseus, and the king, enraged, terrified, has Danae and the infant Perseus placed in a wooden chest and has the chest thrown into the sea. But instead of sinking, the chest with its 2 inmates washes up on the shore of an island where a shepherd finds it. The shepherd looks after Danae and her son. And in due course, Perseus grows into a muscular, agile youth. He is, after all, the son of a god. Perseus, who has been told of the oracle's prediction, decides to return to his ancestral land, the island of his grandfather, to show him he bears him no ill will. He has no desire to kill him. But meanwhile, news has traveled to Argos that Perseus has slain the Gorgon Medusa, and he's on his way to Argos. The king immediately thinks of the oracle, and knows that Perseus is on his way to kill him. So the king flees his kingdom and his island, disguised as a beggar in sackcloth and ashes. Perseus is approaching the island of Argos, but decides to stop off at the nearby island of Larissa to take part in athletics contests being held there. He's killed a Gorgon, he's half god, he has high hopes of success in the games, and says that if he wins the laurel wreath, he will take this as a gift to his grandfather. He takes part in the discus competition. The stands are crowded, there is expectation in the air. Kentridge now acts out the moment on stage as he continues. Perseus takes the stone discus in his left hand. He builds up momentum, rocking backward and forward, his body undulating as the strength in him grows. He transfers the discus to his right hand, leans back and launches it. It sails over the grassy field, past the marks of the other competitors. The discus soars over the edge of the field and into the stands. In the last row of spectators, it strikes an old man, a beggar, in sackcloth and ashes, and kills him. For me, Kentridge explained, this was intolerable. If only the grandfather had not sat in that seat. Why not one seat to the left or one seat to the right? He would have been safe. Why did Perseus have to take part in the athletics competition? Why did he have to show off? Why did the grandfather have to run away? How could so many chance events, so many unlikely elements, the discus, the disguise, the date of the athletics competition, how could all of these conspire to make the predicted inevitability? Maybe every step I took or didn't take was the wrong one. If Perseus or his grandfather had just read the last page of the book, this could all have been avoided. But once launched, the discus could not be called back. With this story, the Harvard audience was transported, first to imagine the 8-year-old artist on a train with his father from the city of Johannesburg, where they lived, to the southern tip of the African continent in Port Elizabeth. And I suspect many besides myself, even in that scholarly audience, wondered at the thought of having a father who read the story of Perseus to his children in 1968. Already we feel out of time. Layered over this was the idea of a nostos, or an epic journey, in which we follow the hero Perseus on his journey home, whose grandfather met his fate, despite his extraordinary efforts to avoid it. And the struggle of Kentridge himself against the same inescapable arc of the discus as he attempted to prolong its course through several arabesques before it hits its mark. Now, if you can hold that story in your mind, we will be coming back to it. First, a little context. We know that William Kentridge yearns for European cultures of the past. But however much the young artist may have wished otherwise, Kentridge was born into apartheid South Africa, a place he referred to in a recent lecture in Cape Town as the periphery. Kentridge explains. Here is a photograph taken by David Goldblatt in 1978 in Boksburg, a small town to the east of Johannesburg. A young ballet dancer on the veranda of her house under a pergola. What is it that holds us, that held me when I first saw it in 1981? Of course, the tutu and the point shoes, but also the beatific expression of the girl, an ecstatic dream, the dream of being a prima ballerina assoluta, of Rudolf Nureyev on the other side of the stage, of Swan Lake and Giselle. How the dreams crash. It is not so much the pergola that crashes down on the dancer. It's the harsh sunlight of the high-veld winter. I would describe this photograph as merciless. There is no place to protect this dream of Europe. William Kentridge's grandfather, Morris Kentridge, was born in Lithuania and when he was 6 moved with his family to Great Britain. By the time he landed in Cape Town during the Second Boer War in 1901, Morris had already settled on a career in the law and planned to run for office. In 1912, all members of the family changed their name from Kentridge to Kentridge. Morris was elected to Parliament in 1914 at the age of 33, known for fighting the underdog from the rights of workers to the plight of Jewish refugees during the war. He held a seat until his retirement in 1958, when William was 3 years old. Morris's son, Sidney, William's father, whom you see here on the bottom slides, he is, let's see if I can get this to work, yeah. He's the one on the far right here, and the one on the, far left there, and the one on the left here. And this is he a few years ago. He's 94 now and still doing very well. Let's see. So he received his law degree from Oxford and set up his practice in Johannesburg in 1949, the year after apartheid was enacted. Both Morris and Sidney were, quote, at the forefront of the fight against segregation and apartheid, end quote. That comes from Morris's obituary. Sidney Kentridge has said that his proudest professional achievement was representing 3 recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize. He participated in some of the best-known cases of the apartheid era, representing the defendants in the treason trial, those who lost relatives in the Sharpeville massacre, and the family of Steve Biko. His performance in that trial was so remarkable that a TV courtroom drama was made of it, starring Albert Finney. In fact, William comes from a long line of lawyers. His mother, Felicia Geffen, also a legal advocate, found a legal aid society to help the country's underserved Black population, the South African Legal Resources Center, which is still active today. And Felicia's mother, Irene, was the first woman to pass the bar in South Africa. For his contributions to the law in both countries, England and South Africa, Sidney Kentridge was knighted by the Queen, so he's now Sir Sidney Kentridge in 1999. A few years ago at the Haus der Kunst, on the occasion of an exhibition of apartheid-era photographs gathered by curator Okui Nwezor, who's there at the top right, father and son were brought together for a conversation about their experiences in South Africa. Racial discrimination was always there, Sir Sidney explained, but in 1948 it became compulsory. At that time, there were not more than 3 million whites. More than 20 million blacks didn't have the right to vote until 1994. They were forced to accept a deliberately inferior education. It was criminal for anyone to leave the country without permission from the government. Despite all of this, the legal system still functioned. There was still a chance of winning, such as the famous treason trial of 1958 to 61, when all the defendants, including Mandela, were acquitted. On the other hand, if you won, the law would be made stronger to make it harder to challenge the next time. Theirs was an extraordinary household. William reminisced about meeting the first head of the African National Congress, Albert Luthuli, who is the gentleman third from the far left on the bottom, in his kitchen during the treason trial when William was a small boy, and the way the family's cook looked up to Luthuli in a way they had never seen before. William Kentridge knew from a young age that his family lived in an unnatural state in South Africa. He describes his mother Felicia's rage while at the kitchen table when trials were discussed. As his parents fought apartheid in the courts, William studied politics and participated in demonstrations during the most violent years. In 1976, at the time of the Soweto uprising, and in 1989, when protest marches were permitted for the first time in many years. In his third year at university, June of 1976, William was photographed at the front of a crowd, which is this one here. It's fascinating to see him that early. At the front of a crowd, bearded at the left, with a banner that read, "Let Soweto decide." His wife, Anne, now a doctor, is also in the photo in the glasses at the front right. The march was in support of families in Soweto, a black township in Johannesburg, where children were to be forced to learn Afrikaans at school. Another photo shows William speaking at a learn-in on the steps of a building at the university. So he's the one with the microphone. These events continue to reverberate through Kentridge's work, single images seared into his memory, like this drawing after the famous Ian Barry photograph of boys holding hands as they run from the bullets at Sharpeville. That took place in 1960. Or cones forensically marking the position of bodies following the massacre at the Marikana mines only a few years ago, as hats had done in earlier times. On a tour of the outskirts of Johannesburg, Kentridge's native landscape, I photographed the piled-up earth caused by the digging of a mine. This common feature serves as the subject of a drawing Kentridge made on old mine company ledger paper and reappears frequently elsewhere in his work. Kentridge's film Other Faces from 2011 includes a scene in the graveyard where his grandparents are buried, a few miles from his home. This is his life world. He does not take to illustrating a new, fresh, green landscape even now as he spends so much of his time traveling abroad. Added to the long history of marches and processions and protest is a formal parallel from history, a classic Kentridge example of the layering of his source material. There is never only one inspiration, but multiple images, phrases, and thoughts that come into his head and are brought into use, repurposed for the work in progress. A 15th century draftsman from the Netherlands gave Kentridge the initial spark for the series of arc-shaped drawings he made in 1989 to 90, an important time for him as an artist and for his country as it battled its way out of apartheid. An artist from the circle of Roger van der Weyden, town painter of Brussels, made a design for a capital relief carving with a shape that could show all sides at once. The solution seems to have intrigued Kentridge, although it may have been the iconography that attracted him to it in the first instance. The drawing's enigmatic imagery holds multiple levels of significance that would appeal to him. The sheet is known as men shoveling chairs, a pun on the word scoopstoel, literally meaning shovel chair, a contraption used for public humiliation in which felons were raised above water and dropped in. Kentridge borrowed the curved form of the capital design and gradually reduced the size and detail of his figures to suggest that each end recesses to infinity. It is a procession on one page. The condition of drawing and painting already seems confining for Kentridge, and we see that animation, the medium that would most define him in the coming decade or so, is hinted at, even when it is a single drawing pinned to a wall. During these early years, Kentridge also found a catalyst in Francisco Goya's Disasters of War. He was drawn to the masterful series in part because of the Spanish artist's exceptional skill in printmaking, a talent Kentridge shares, and because Goya too had been living through a critical historical moment, the brutal Peninsular War of 1808 to 14, the devastations of which moved him to depict the suffering of the people as a form of protest. Each artist honed his considerable technical skills in order to more effectively illustrate and thereby demonstrate against the moral degradation he saw around him. Thus, when Kentridge is drawing Smoke Ashes Fable, which is the top one, visually quotes from Goya's Disasters, he's paying homage not only to the earlier master's technique, but also to his ethical principles. The echo of Goya's dramatic scene placed at the head of a line of workers combines a symbolic rape, the control of bodies through violence, with a march of protest against the exploitation of workers in South Africa. The slogan Smoke Ashes Fable here signals the very real threat to civilization when force is used to hold on to wealth and power. The evocative phrase originated with the early Greek historian Herodotus, whom Marcus Aurelius, writing around 170 CE, paraphrased in his Meditations. Quote, "Next I asked myself the question, where is it all now? Smoke, ashes, fable, or perhaps it is no longer even fable," end quote. Kentridge came across this classical reference in The Emperor by Kapuscinski, an account of the end of Haile Selassie's reign in Ethiopia. An African leader on whom huge hopes had been placed, Selassie became shamefully corrupt, causing terrible suffering in his country. The lines from the Meditations serve as a warning against hubris and excessive ambition. Each time Kentridge used the quote, it appears repeatedly throughout his career, the words take on different nuances of meaning: smoke rising from the ruins of battle, funereal ashes, tales of heroes long gone. The notion of histories forgotten or buried is a recurring theme in Kentridge's oeuvre, most famously represented by a body dissolving into the earth in what may remain his best-known work to date, Felix in Exile. Kentridge documented the suffering he saw around him in the most effective way he knew how, in order to try to reach and motivate or even express his frustration. How could he address what was happening in Soweto with the intellectualized musings of Joseph Beuys or Bruce Nauman, much as he may have admired those artists? Instead, driven to use the best means at his disposal to reach the most people, he worked to conjure narrative theater in two-dimensional form. The same may be said for Kentridge's approach to materials, paper, charcoal, and ink. They were the most appropriate for the task at hand. The subject called for sober reality, so Goya made his Disasters of War devoid of color. Ian Barry's Sharpeville photographs, seared into Kentridge's sensitive mind at a very young age, were done in a journalistic black and white. As South African photographer David Goldblatt explained, during those years, color seemed too sweet a medium to express the anger, disgust, and fear that apartheid inspired. Eventually, despite the movement suggested by the shape and the line of figures facing mostly left, ultimately the arc must have felt too static and confined. The medium of film provided the animation he longed for. The first of his series of short films, Drawings for Projection, which starred the unlikely hero Soho Eckstein, Johannesburg's second greatest city after Paris of 1989, introduces the Kentridge Procession in its nascent form. This clip that I'm going to show will last about 1 minute. the abrupt ending there. That's hard to control from here. The artist had also noted his admiration for Goya's processions, one example of which you see here from about 1820. These hand-animated films were created by making a drawing for a given scene, walking to the camera 4 paces away, taking 2 photographs, walking back to the drawing, making a slight change, walking back to the camera, taking 2 photographs, walking back to the drawing, make a slight change, et cetera, et cetera. The images are combined and run through a projector at 24 frames per second. The process takes about 6 months to complete, depending on other work he has going on at the same time. It is another form of procession in itself. Next, his Shadow Procession of 1999, one of his most moving works, was made with torn paper figures using a stop-action filming technique. It was first projected on the wall of a cistern in Istanbul. Since this film comes after the end of apartheid and the lifting of the cultural boycott against South Africa, by this time Kentridge was becoming well known outside of his country. This clip will also last about a minute. Should be, there you go. So from there, we skip forward to the procession at the end of Refusal of Time. This has no sound, which uses a combination of animated background and live-action silhouetted figures. The earlier form is enriched by a more complex technique. With a somewhat higher budget, assistance, a team of collaborators, it is clearly a descendant of the previous examples. Since 2012, 2 more monumental processions have been made, and a new one is in progress. The first, a mural on the banks of the Tiber in Rome, had its debut a few years ago with a live performance, and the work itself will remain until dirt and pollution obscures it from view. The figures are drawn from Roman history and illustrate the idea that one person's triumph is another's lament. Though common threads run throughout the processions, especially in formal ways, they are the result of different impulses driven by different content. Somehow the monumental processions keep coming, and they're getting bigger and bigger. Like Rembrandt's self-portraits, processions seem best for his most ambitious projects. He recently described some of the thoughts that went into his most recent live-action animated procession, the 8-channel video installation, More Sweetly Play the Dance. And this is a still photograph of the installation in Bruges, which was in the ancient building, ancient hospital. So this is William's description. There is the understanding of how much human foot power, and by the way, this is silent too, human foot power and manual power is still part of the world. People physically putting their world on their shoulders and walking across the world. What's been happening in Europe recently has been happening in Africa for 40 or 50 years, and before that it was happening in the Balkans. It goes back to our very first images and references to shadows of people walking, as in Plato's cave. More Sweetly Play the Dance started off as a dance of death. the medieval form of death taking everyone, from king to priest to farmer to child, everybody. I was first alerted to it in a completely different context, working on the Alban Berg opera, Lulu. At the end of one scene, when her first husband lies dead, the line is, well, his dance is over. When we were filming South African religious ceremonies with everybody circling came into it. There is also the medieval form. If you kept dancing, you could escape the plague. Yet I'm not really sure it is a dance of death. There was a South African poet writing about the Marikana massacre when police shot 34 miners in South Africa a few years ago now. The last line of his poem is, quote, "The strike is over, the dead go back to work," end quote. It is a sense of the dead moving across the landscape. It is an accumulation of different figures and kinds of movement, end quote. The background before the arrival of figures is bleak, filled only with cloud and smoke. A Johannesburg slag heap rises above the horizon in one section of the landscape that stretches down the long length of the 8 screens. The title, More Sweetly Play the Dance, comes from a line in Todesfuge, Paul Celan's devastating poem set in the death camps of World War II. He calls out, "More sweetly play death. Death is a master from Germany." He calls out more darkly now, "Stroke your strings, then as smoke you will rise into air. Then a grave you will have in the clouds, there one lies unconfined." Minute changes animate the black and white projections continually, behind the moving figures filmed in muted color, almost black, layered on top. Then the band starts to play with the Great March of Figures, and the Great March of Figures begins, moving left to right, a parade to the beat of the music, a string of memories, a mixture of historical and personal events. It seems that 100 figures and animated objects file by, the way they say life passes before one's eyes at the end. Coupled with the complex imagery, the music is loud and unsettling and somehow festive. So now I'm going to play this with the sound. That's supposed to be loud. Kentridge continues, "It's fantastic, the energy of the brass band, the bad brass band. I'm interested in the brass band falling apart rather than the perfect one, the illusions of grandeur and of power. In the same way that the work embodies both things that feel private and personal and things that spread out onto the streets and look at broader things, the music is allowed to go in both directions." Though juggling many other projects, including an opera production of Wozzeck that opened at Salzburg Festival last summer that comes to the Metropolitan Opera in New York next year, Kentridge is currently at work on his largest procession yet. Titled Head in the Load, the production was commissioned in part for the New York Armory. And I don't know if you know, the New York Armory is a gigantic space, often shared with many different people showing works of art for sale or what have you, and he's taking the entire space for this. It's also going to be seen at the Tate Modern in London. He will lead a workshop, the standard process for his operas and other large-scale productions, at Mass MoCA in the Berkshires in late April and early May. And these are a few images from the last workshop in Johannesburg a few months ago. So this is one. And that's the same setup he uses for all of these filming projects in the last, I would say, 8 years or so. Having laid the groundwork for an understanding of Kentridge's biography, a broad sketch of some of his work to date that seems relevant to our purpose, I would like to turn now to some specific details of Refusal of Time with those issues and images in mind. When deciding on the topics they wanted to raise, Kentridge and his dramaturge, Harvard historian of science Peter Galison, and incidentally, he's the one who introduced me to Kentridge back in 2012. He, by the way, this is the cast of characters up here who always work on all of these projects since, I think since Refusal of Time was the first time. So this is Peter Galison here. This is Philip Miller, the composer. This is his editor, Catherine. Greta does the costumes, Sabine set design, and this is Kim who controls the video, which she follows the score and tells the video when to go and when to stop. So this crew he always works with, and they travel with him everywhere, and they're known as the Kentourage. Oh, and at the bottom, this is This is Dada Masilo, whom you've seen dancing in the installation upstairs, who's always as often as he can manage, she's the one who works with him on the dance part. And Joanna Dudley is a frequent collaborator with performance. Both Kentridge and Galison were drawn to the historical period of visible modernity. That is, before computer chips, black boxes, and code eliminated the visual signs of an object's function. Kentridge explains, "There are certain objects I've come to as someone making drawings, objects that meet the drawing halfway. If you take an old bakelite telephone, its blackness is already halfway to being a charcoal drawing. But more than that, once you're drawing it, there's a set of associations that come from old manual mechanical switchboard telephones. If you think of a switchboard, there's a cord that would connect the caller and the receiver, and the representation of it looks like a black line drawn across the holes of the switchboard. In my case of drawing and animation, something that is now perhaps invisible, connecting people across phone lines, across continents, is rendered in a very visible way, and may even be a description of an obsolete process. It is not so much being fascinated with the ideas of the late 19th century, but that it is still such a visible era, in a way in which the electronic era is not. Even if one is talking about contemporary phenomena, very often an older representation is a better way of drawing it." That idea was then stretched further. In the examples that follow, historical and art historical sources inspired representations of the invisible made visible. To show the manipulation or warps in time, film runs backwards or forwards, or on a loop. So here you're seeing the bottom and the top left are from Refusal of Time, and the top right is a clip from Ballet Mécanique. And I'm not looping these are shown as they were. At the bottom right here, a player piano roll. That's from Refusal of Time, and the other things are to show where that comes from. It's basically a negative filming of a piano roll, and that is a way of expressing the event horizon of a black hole, where you're trying to depict string theory, which is pretty difficult to do. This is showing Chapp's telegraph system, once connecting virtually the whole of France, sent messages in visual code, and he used it here in the top left in Refusal of Time as if signaling through space. And this is actually showing you all of these spots on the map of France had one of these, and they would send signals using that system in the early 19th century. And it continued for a long time. This lonely signaling out to no one in particular had appeared in his film Sleeping on Glass from 1996. I just add her because this comes from a dream he had. So clearly it's a concept that's been sitting in his mind for a long time. How can one represent the passing of time? An idea from Man Ray, perhaps. At first he had used a metronome to time, he being Man Ray, had used a metronome to time his work on a picture to keep himself from working too long without bringing it to completion. After American photographer and model Lee Miller left him, he attached her eye to it, calling it object to be destroyed. Then he smashed it. This later version, produced in an edition of 100, was called Indestructible Object because he suggested it would be very difficult to destroy all 100. The idea of her watching him with time ticking by suggests melancholy, regret, loss, with what may occasionally have felt like an oppressive, watchful presence. The bottom left is a clip from Refusal of Time, and the three images at the top are by Man Ray. Upper right, a so-called rayograph, which is made by exposing photographic paper to light briefly in a dark room with objects placed on the surface of the paper. The other two show solarization, or the Sabatier effect, occurring when light is switched on in the dark room while a film or print is being developed. Man Ray perfected the technique after Lee Miller made the discovery in his darkroom. The bottom right is Duchamp's bicycle wheel. Many of Kentridge's sculptures are descendants of the Dada ready-made. In Refusal, Dada Masilo dances in a costume and manner inspired by Loie Fuller, a world-famous dancer filmed by Edison and then by the Lumiere Brothers studios in 1896 in Paris. She was the toast of the Paris avant-garde and had friends in the highest society. Fuller was not a talented dancer, but she did patent the dress she designed, and she was a savvy businesswoman and creative dramatist who made the most of her talent. Images or films of her doing the serpentine dance are thought to be iconic representations of the Art Nouveau era. All of these cultural references and artistic techniques are put to use in Refusal of Time as if drawing from a universal archive in space. The idea of being in perfect time, and I'm going to check my time as well, may be traced back to the era when Paris and London battled for control of the world's clocks. Greenwich Mean Time remains our standard since the 19th century on which all clocks are set. The colonial powers in Europe, having conquered lands on distant continents, brought hygienic time to the world, and the clocks in the colonies were rigidly to follow the standard provided by their ruling government. Thus, a metaphor for colonial resistance and refusal of time becomes the repeated phrase, "Give us back our sun." That is, each geographical area should mark time according to the position of the sun overhead. An anarchist's attempt to blow up the Greenwich Observatory turned into the 5 short silent films that you saw. They were paper sets made under time constraints, 3 hours to draw a set, then to film for 2 hours, redraw the next one, and film for 2 hours. In the 19th century in France, time was controlled using a system of pumped air. The machinery connected to public clocks as well as private ones for a fee. Tubes led from the central pumping station all the way into one's living room and attached to move the clock forward every minute with a puff of air. The system reminded Kentridge of the so-called honey pump installed at Documenta in the 70s by Joseph Beuys. The idea of pumped air time inspired everything from the sound of the tuba in the music to the pneumatic man, who should be moving. Let's try him again. There we go. He's the pneumatic man. You see him connected like as if he were a clock. To the so-called breathing machine or elephant in the center of the space. When asked in Kassel at the time of the premiere, Kentridge explained, "The elephant comes from Dickens' Hard Times," referring to the industrial machines in the factory in the 19th century. Dickens describes them moving up and down like the movement of the head of an elephant in a state of melancholy madness. Endlessly just moving up and down. It has to do with the relentless nature of industrial society, end quote. In addition to this, the machine is like the lungs of the piece, the bellows, keeping it moving. It is another example of the visualization of an idea, that time equals breathing, of clock as body and body as clock. If I slow my breathing, do I control time? Can I avoid the discus? What is the best way to experience refusal of time? In the first showing at Documenta 13 in Kassel, and in all the places in the world where it has been since, there are 5 screens, 2 on each long wall and 1 at the far end, with a large moving sculpture in the middle. Megaphones stand at various locations in the room with speakers in them, projecting the 5 tracks of sound. Chairs are located around the room, randomly placed, freely moved to the desired position, rather than lined up in movie theater rows. The soundtrack with Kentridge's voice cannot be heard in all parts of the room over the cacophony of music, and it should be very loud, if at all possible. So if one wants to try to decipher the words and their reasoning, one needs to move. Kentridge is very pro-movement, as you've probably gathered. Simply sitting in one spot and letting it all flow over you for the half-hour running time is certainly an approach that has been tried and enjoyed. Now, let's just check. Yeah, this one. But here's one passage heard in the front right corner of the room. The text offers a universe of ideas spinning off the complex and mesmerizing visual content. And this is now Kentridge's voice, which is a lot better. In the mid-19th century, attempts were made to fix the speed of light. Using mirrors, prisms, spinning discs, it was found that light traveled not infinitely fast, but at an invariant speed of approximately 186,000 miles per second. Light and a projection take a finite time to get from site of generation to site of reception. Expanding from this discovery, the German scientist Felix postulated all of the space as a universal archive of all that had happened on Earth. The light of every event was moving out from the Earth at a speed of 186,000 miles per second. If one was at the right point in space, one could see any event that had happened. Near a star 2,000 light years away, one could see Pontius Pilate washing his hands. Near a star 500 years away, Luther could be seen nailing his 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg. Every action, heroic or shameful, was there to be seen. Every secret deed was visible. Once launched, an image, an event, a discus cannot be called back. It has the pressure of perfect memory. It has the same inevitability as the claim that no keystroke is ever lost, that once done, something cannot be undone. The email cannot be unsent. Every foolishness is there, every embarrassment. The universal archive becomes also an overstocked, miserable collection of surplus images. We're caught between wanting to send ourselves out and to hold back, to call back, to annul and obliterate so many traces and acts, to undo, to unsay, to unremember, to unhappen, end quote. On the other hand, this concept is oddly reassuring. Somewhere in space, I'm only 29 years old. And when I'm no longer here on Earth, I'll be up there giving this lecture or sitting with my children on a beach. That is the heart of the piece, the question of whether we leave anything of ourselves behind. Somewhere in space, the discus has not hit its target. Now this should be low, please. Thank you. Fanciful imaginings like Ébert's inspired Einstein to use similar narratives to explain his theory of relativity, which is one reason why he became such a phenomenon during his lifetime. The story of twins who aged at different rates because one had been traveling in space and the other had stayed on Earth is one such example. And before I start this moving, I'll just tell you that this figure here is Kentridge, eating soup. So this final bit I'm going to read is a sort of bringing together of the ideas both Kentridge and Galison speaking at different times, but I've put them together. Is a black hole the end of time? If that is one of the questions that physicists consider. But as soon as you say, let's have things disappearing into a black hole, it is an immediate jump to that being, as it were, a metaphorical description of death. Is there any trace when you're gone? Is there any information, attributes of you that still float around the edge? In the black hole debate, one side contended that a black hole truly was an end to all things, a portent of the final stage of the universe. The other desperately wanted to prove that somehow all the information swallowed up would survive. Coded far beyond easy recognition, to be sure, but there nonetheless. And in the black hole battle, in this ultimate refusal of the end of time, the side that wants to believe there is something left behind seems to have won because of the development of string theory. It means that all of the information that falls into that hole would leave something on the surface, a kind of holographic image of the thing that it had fallen into it. If that is so, then some trace of memory remains. Thank you. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to try.
I have a question about the last piece. You said that was 2 pieces of writing and you interwove them.
Oh, yeah. That last thing comes from the interview in Kassel that I did at the occasion of the opening. I interviewed them, and so I just took their 2 best bits, and I didn't want to take the time to say, now this is so-and-so. But basically, if it's artistic, it's William, and if it's scientific, it's Peter. I hope that's helpful. But you can find it online. Yeah.
Since you were in that castle in 2012, I was wondering if you could talk to us about that experience of seeing the framework of Documenta 13 and how the work has changed or transformed since then for you, as much as objectively?
Sure. Sorry, I'm gravelly voiced from the flight, I think, the extravagant trip. So let's think. 2012, I had been taking a break from art history, and when I saw the Norton lectures, I was inspired, as I mentioned. So I asked Peter and William at Peter's house, the occasion I met Kentridge, can I do an interview? And then I found New York Review of Books had a online new thing. Now it's called the Daily. Then it was called the Blog, where you could have film. You could watch film if you wanted. So they would have film clips, and I would do this interview, and it would go up right away. That was the advantage of it. So they were keen to do that, and I flew over there. But I had never, since I had always been an old master person, I had never been to Documenta. So in a way, that was kind of a good thing because I was not intimidated as I might have been otherwise. It's quite a scene. The effect of it there was he had already been a kind of star, Kentridge had, in on previous occasions in that venue. And so he was pretty comfortable at that point. And Galison is a very well-established historian of science. And so when I went along for this interview, first I looked at the installation of the work going up. That brief moment, you probably missed it because there was too much to look at, but there was a brief moment of actually watching the installation while it's being put up, like testing that it's all working. And that was the best way to see it because a place like the Metropolitan Museum, which was the second place I saw it, it had to be quote unquote roughed up, as William said, because the walls were too boxy and perfect, and it had to, as you've done here, you had to bring in some other textured wall elements to kind of make it look rough. But in Kassel, it was actually in an old railroad brick kind of intentionally. I think they chose this rough space. And so it had other layers, therefore. I think it was a place where people had been lined up to be shipped out during the Holocaust at one stage. There was some kind of historical resonance there. And indeed, every time it's shown, it has different reactions. Different kinds of people react to it in different ways. I saw it in Johannesburg. It was installed in the beautiful old museum, which is now, was empty. And I think the opening night was probably packed, but when I went, the entire museum was completely empty. And I think that's just, things are hard there. And so, every time there are different political aspects to it that come out. But ultimately, the experience for me in the beginning was almost like a religious experience because I really did feel like it when you look at the stars, when you go on vacation and you're out in the countryside and you look at stars and you feel tiny, it's very reassuring. It had that kind of effect on me too, this one. I hope I answered your question. Yes?
What do you think Peter Galison is getting out of the relationship?
That's a nice way of putting it. So Peter's also a filmmaker. He's made some documentaries. He, on the occasion in Kassel where there were some gallery talks and other, not performances, but occasions where they came together and spoke, Peter did a gallery talk, I'll never forget, where, and I've known Peter since I've known my husband, so almost 20 years. It was a perfect audience for Peter. There were German people interested in art who probably were all scientists as well or something. But they started asking him questions after his gallery talk, which was about scientific instruments and the refusal of time and how these things came together. And somehow they got on the topic of how many dimensions there really are. And he was able to give an answer that, and this is how he always is, but sometimes he's really in his element. He explained that, in fact, and I'm sure I'm going to get this wrong, so I almost want to tell you not to film this, but it was something like, we're not really three-dimensional beings, and 4 dimensions isn't right either. It's something more like 11 dimensions. And the reason we see things the way we do is because we can't possibly understand the reality. And he went through this explaining something about cubes being multiple times expanded in space, and everybody in the room except for me followed it perfectly. And at the end of his explanation, which took about 10 minutes to answer this question, everyone there, and there were maybe 35 people, burst into applause. And I've never seen that happen in a gallery talk before. So, so he, I think, has gotten a lot out of it in that sense. I don't know if you noticed that the title in the other room has the collaborators' names very large. And I think William is a great collaborator. He, as I mentioned, his team works with him all the time because he's such a great collaborator. And I think he has come to appreciate the importance of making sure everybody's name is clearly getting its due position, prominent position. So I think he's gotten a lot, Peter's gotten a lot of great experience out of it. And also this, in my opinion, this will be remembered. So he's contributed to something that will last, hopefully. Yeah.
And with your fascination here, do you see in him parallel with the Renaissance minds, the artists of the Renaissance time?
I do, yeah. Well, maybe pushing a little bit into the Baroque. I think of Rubens a lot with him because Rubens was an incredible businessman in the sense of being well organized and managing many things at once. And he's really in his element, Kentridge, when he has too much to do. And I think he loves it. So if he has an opera opening at the Met and a retrospective at MoMA and 10 interviews, then he's happy. And then he has several different studios in Johannesburg. He has steel, sculpture construction, a bronze foundry, which other artists also use, but he helped found it, and they do a lot of his work. Then he has a downtown studio for those huge production things that I showed, where he can film and practice with large groups. And then he has his studio, which he now lives in his father's. His father bought a house that was built in the 30s, but I think his father bought it in the 50s or so. And it's this glorious place, and then he built a studio there. So most of the time he works just by walking from here to where the camera is there, from his house to the studio. But there are these many other places. So that's, I think, when I think of Rubens, I think it's similar because also Rubens was famous for reading several languages and being in touch with many intellectuals and being very politically savvy. I think Rubens acted as an ambassador for his country on many occasions, and Kentridge is kind of like that too, I think. He would say that I'm exaggerating, but I did one lecture that actually ended up turning into the exhibition in Bruges called William Kentridge, Renaissance Man of Johannesburg. So yes, you're right. Yes. I used to think that he, when you think you know things and then you get to know someone better, you realize how wrong you are. And I still fluctuate because he doesn't really spell anything out. But in the beginning, I felt that his main thing was the short films, and that the opera was something he used as a way to use the short films in a creative way. But actually, the more I got to know him, the more I realized that he's really such a theatrical. He comes from theater and television and film and wanted to be an actor, didn't feel he was good enough, wanted to be a director, couldn't get the funding. All of these things were hemming him in, so he found a way to do all those things by being a great draftsman and a great printmaker, incidentally, really beautiful prints. So I think he's kind of found a way towards doing more and more of the opera, which uses all of it. It's like a Gesamtkunstwerk all together, and he can go all over the world, which I think he really likes. And he keeps this huge crew employed all the time as well by having these big projects going. So right now, having a new one that's done well in Salzburg and then it'll be going, I think I've read that it's also going to Australia or something as well as New York. So that's the kind of thing that I think I don't know if you've ever seen one of his operas, but they use the animated films, the drawings, his experience as a director. It's kind of his opportunity to do everything. And then, you know, when he has an exhibition at Marion Goodman Gallery, he has the drawings from Lulu, or he has the, you know, drawings from Wozzeck, et cetera. So he can keep them all. The juggling can be kept going all at the same time.
Can you tell us anything about how he works with the composer for the original music, like in Refusal of Time?
Yeah, so Philip Miller is I think he lives in Cape Town. I'm pretty sure he lives in Cape Town. But anyway, he's South African. And he has this kind of unique, recognizable sound. He almost, I mean, I'll exaggerate probably by saying that, but he works with him a lot. And especially with a brand new project, like Head in the Load, that one that he's doing now is with Philip, and this one here is with Philip. So he's the one who brought in Joanna Dudley, that woman that I showed the picture of on stage. So I don't know if you know, there's also a stage version of Refusal of Time called Refuse the Hour, and she was in that, along with a lot of other South African performers. And so Philip Miller, I think, along with his crew that tends to recur, is doing a lot of his work. I don't know what percentage of his work he does with William, but a great percentage. And he's certainly gotten more and more famous as a result of all of this outside. But then William has also the operas like, you know, Alban Berg and things, and that obviously would be the local opera company would do that.
Struck me this time that his impulse to the Gesamtkunstwerk is, in a way, opposite of Wagner's original idea of Wagner being totalizing. And Kentridge is looking for something that is the opposite.
Yeah.
He knows he'll never reach.
Yeah. Well, I hate to guess, but my assumption is that he'd be glad that it doesn't remind you of Wagner. And I think he really, what would draw him to a project would be, I heard him once describe the Refusal of Time as a boozy, you know, crazy mess of something, which of course it isn't. It's extremely carefully done, and it wasn't boozy. He doesn't really drink that much, but that's what he wants to convey, is a kind of, you know, I don't know if you saw The Nose or any of his operas. They tend to be so much going on. A lot of the critics say, you know, I don't know how I could focus on the music because there were so many visuals going on. Whereas those of us who are more visual, and Alban Berg is, you know, challenging music for those of us who are not opera fanatics. You know, he makes it work for some and maybe not for others, but he likes that kind of everything. You know, there's one thing in the Norton lectures where he talks about everything being put into the hat and shaken up and thrown on the floor, and you see what comes out. And that's kind of, he's like the magician who pulls the rabbit out of the hat, and he never knows. One of the things for someone who's so organized and methodical in some ways, he forces himself not to plan so that everything remains spontaneous and fresh. So in that sense, he's very much different from a Wagner. Yeah. Thank you.